Now we'll talk about perspective distortion. Let's say if you took your 18 to 55 and you shot your subject at 18 millimeters, it would look different than if you shot it at 24 millimeters or 55 millimeters. Basically what's happening is you're changing the distance between you and your subject. If you're shooting people up close, let's say with the 18 millimeter, like right on their nose, you might see that it looks really big, whereas the rest of their head looks way back. But if you shot someone with, let's say, 200 millimeters, then everything looks more or less flat. Here we're going to take a look at a couple of photos that I've taken with a zoom lens, but this applies to any lens really. I'm just changing the focal lengths and it's more convenient for me to take photos at different distances. So what I'm basically doing is taking some shots, moving back a little bit, zooming further in with the lens, stepping back, zooming further in, and so forth. So the very first photo that I have is at 17 millimeter. I'm using the Tamron 17 to 52.8, and for anything longer than that, I'm using the Nikon 55 to 200 VR. So here we have the 17 millimeter, and as you see, my subject's nose is pretty big and their feet look pretty big also. It's because at the edges it sort of stretches things out and it kind of makes things kind of oddly proportioned. And if we move towards 24 millimeter, everything looks a little slightly different. And then now we look at 35 millimeter. Again, it's different. And 50 millimeter, I actually see a little bit of the eye. And the last one is 65 millimeter. And here we looks like we have more of a head-on view. Here we have taken a look at a couple of photos, all taken at different focal lengths and effectively distances on the same subject matter. And as you see, it looks quite different. So depending on your style or the flavor that you want, you may want to make a more active and conscious decision about choosing what focal lengths you want. So whether you're trying to buy a new lens using a prime lens or a zoom lens, it's something to consider. The last few aesthetic properties I want to talk about are contrast and color. Now in today's modern world, there are image editing programs that can adjust those things. So it's not necessarily the final word, whether your lens can't do as great of a job, but some people, they want to get the best or closest to final thing in their mind out of the camera. We're going to now take a look at a couple of photos in terms of color and contrast. You might have seen this image before. I used it in my previous part on bokeh. So a little bit more about these images. I didn't do much in terms of editing them, so we shouldn't really look too hard upon how accurate the colors are. You should take a look at them relative towards each other. In this very first image, I was using the Nikon 55 to 200 VR, and as you see, it looks pretty good, just as is. Moving to the next image, this is the 80 to 200 AFS. When you look at this, actually, in comparison, it looks like it's lost a little bit of contrast and the colors are not as rich. Well, one thing to note is sometimes lenses of different eras, certainly the 80 to 200 AFS is not exactly the newest lens anymore. Certain things have progressed, and I think that modern lenses, even though they could be cheaper lenses, sometimes might exhibit high contrast or higher contrast than other images. Whether this is better or not, it's adjustable. You can adjust your settings in your camera, in your image editing program, so you can get away with it a little bit more. But just looking at these two images, I would be much happier with the 55-200 VR. Moving on to the next set of images from the Canon lenses, you'll notice that there's a distinct color shift. The tomatoes look more orange and less red. Basically, when I adjusted the white balance, they were pretty different, and that's why it does look pretty different. I wouldn't really take too much note that the color is that different. It's not as if the Canon lens or system takes worst color, but it's just something which I didn't bother to actually accurately try to calibrate between all the lenses and the camera systems, so I wouldn't put too much weight in it. But just taking a look at this picture, the lens seems to provide, a decent image. It's pretty good. Moving on to the next lens. Here we have the f4IS version. The first image we saw was the 2.8 version. Looking at these two images, the difference between them is less than the difference between the two Nikon images. But one thing to note is the f4IS version does have a little bit more contrast. It's not as stark of a difference, but it's noticeable to me. Well, that's it for this part of the section on why and how to choose lenses. In the next part, I'm going to talk about the more technical performance of a lens. I mean, after all, if you've chosen what you want, where you're going to use it, what kind of photos you want, you might have narrowed down the lenses down to a couple of choices. But there are some technical tests which can actually show, and I'll talk about a little bit more about how to interpret them. Okay, see you. Bye.